It was a chilly evening in early winter, and the Langston estate was glowing like a palace under golden lights. Outside, the air was crisp, but inside, laughter echoed through the vast halls. Wealthy guests dressed in the finest clothes moved through the marble corridors, sipping wine, talking about business, travel, and all the things that made them feel important. Chandeliers sparkled above their heads. The smell of roasted duck, grilled salmon, and expensive perfume filled the room. Everything looked perfect, rich, polished, and untouchable. In the center of it all sat Edward Langston. He was a millionaire, maybe even a billionaire, no one really knew. He had inherited money, doubled it in real estate, and tripled it through investments. Edward had charm, power, and arrogance. People didn't say no to him, and he liked it that way. Was the kind of man who could insult you with a smile and make you thank him for it. His parties were famous among the elite, not because people liked him, but because missing them meant missing a chance to be seen. But Edward was not known for being kind. He treated his staff like shadows. He didn't notice who served his drinks or cleaned his floors, and especially not Maria, the housekeeper who had worked in his estate for over 10 years. Maria was quiet, always in a neat gray uniform, hair tied in a bun, eyes calm but distant. She moved like someone who had learned to survive without being noticed. She never talked back, never asked for anything. Most guests didn't even realize she was there. To them, she was just part of the background, like a painting on the wall or a statue in the corner. That evening, the mansion was alive with celebration. Edward had just closed a major business deal and was throwing one of his usual victory dinners. He was seated at the long oak dining table, surrounded by lawyers, celebrities, CEOs, and socialites. Everyone was in a good mood. The wine was flowing, the jazz band in the corner was playing softly, and the laughter grew louder with every glass. Then, in the middle of the laughter, Edward looked bored. He tilted his glass, looked around the room, and then spotted Maria standing silently near the entrance of the dining room, holding a tray. With a grin that held more mischief than warmth, Edward raised his voice slightly and said, "Maria, play us something on the piano? I want to laugh." Everyone turned toward her. A few chuckled. They thought he was joking. But Edward wasn't. He waved his hand toward the grand piano in the parlor. It was a huge black Steinway, polished every week but rarely played. Maria stood still. Her face didn't change. She didn't flinch or smile. She looked at Edward, then at the guests, and then at the piano. Edward added, "Come on, surprise. Us. Show us what you've got." Someone whispered, "Oh, this is going to be good," expecting some clumsy mess of sound. Another guest whispered louder, "She probably doesn't even know which key is which." They all smiled cruelly, waiting for an awkward performance. In their minds, Maria was just a housekeeper, a woman with no story, no dreams, no talent. Maria nodded once. Without saying a word, she walked across the room. Her shoes made soft clicks on the marble floor. The guests turned their chairs to face her. Someone refilled their glass, ready to be entertained by her failure. She reached the piano, sat down slowly, and gently lifted the cover off the keys. Her fingers hovered above them for a moment. Then she closed her eyes. What happened next was not what anyone expected. She began to play. At first there was silence, just the sound of a single soft note, then another. And then suddenly, music. Real music filled the room. It wasn't a childish tune or some random keys mashing. It was controlled, elegant, and powerful. The melody grew with every second. Her fingers danced across the keys like they were alive. People stopped drinking. Their chatter died down. Heads turned. Mouths closed. One man's wine glass paused midair. The music wrapped itself around the room like a story being told without words. It wasn't just a song, it was emotion. Sadness, memory, loss, and hope, all hidden inside each note. The kind of music that touches something deep in the chest, something that can't be explained, only felt. The jazz band in the corner, quietly, put their instruments down. One of the women at the table wiped a tear from her eye, confused by where it came from. Even the servers froze in place. Everyone stared, and Edward, he sat completely still. The smile had vanished from his face. His fingers were curled around his wine glass, but he wasn't drinking. His eyes were locked on Maria. He looked almost uncomfortable. Maria kept playing. Her back was straight, her eyes closed, her fingers moving with grace and speed. The melody shifted from gentle to stormy, then back to soft, like the ocean pulling back after a wave. No one laughed. No one dared. When the last note fell into silence, the room remained still. For a few long seconds, no one clapped. Not because they didn't like it, but because they didn't know what to say. It was like waking up from a dream you didn't want to end. Then someone began to clap, softly at first, then louder. Soon the whole room was on their feet, giving Maria a standing ovation. She stood up quietly, gave a small, polite bow, and walked back to her spot near the doorway, like nothing had happened. Edward remained seated. His face was blank, but inside, something had cracked. That music, those notes, had opened a door he didn't know was closed. He wasn't used to feeling anything, not like that. He looked at Maria with new eyes. For the first time, he saw a person, not a servant. That night, too, after the guests left and the house became quiet, Edward sat alone in the parlor. The piano was still open, the keys still warm. He didn't touch them. He just stared at the instrument, replaying the music in his mind. The same music he had once expected to make him laugh had left him speechless. He didn't sleep much that night, and for the first time in a very long time, he began to wonder, who was Maria really? And what kind of life had she lived before this place? He had mocked her, tried to make a joke out of her, but she had responded not with anger, not with silence, but with beauty. And that beauty had changed the room, and it had changed him, even if he didn't understand it yet. The air in the Langston mansion felt different after that night. Something invisible had shifted. Everyone who had been there carried the memory of Maria's music like a secret in their chest. It wasn't something they could talk about easily. The rich and powerful didn't know how to explain the feeling. They had come for food, wine, and laughter. But they left with something unexpected, the sound of pain and beauty playing inside their heads. Maria returned to her work the next day as if nothing had happened. She wore the same gray uniform. She cleaned the same rooms, polished the same silverware, and moved with the same quiet steps. No one asked her about the piano. No one dared. And she didn't speak of it either. It was like a dream had passed through the room. Only she knew it was real. But Edward Langston couldn't forget that morning. He stood by his bedroom window longer than usual, coffee in hand, thinking. Normally, he would already be on calls, with his business partners or checking stock numbers, but today his mind was elsewhere. The music kept returning to him, soft, powerful, haunting. He didn't understand how someone like Maria could play like that. It didn't fit his picture of the world. He had placed people in categories his whole life. Rich or poor, educated or uneducated, useful or invisible. People had made him feel something real, something he couldn't control. It disturbed him. At lunch, he noticed her again. Maria was dusting the bookshelves in the study. She looked focused, her hands careful as she wiped each book's spine. Edward watched her from across the room, unsure of what to say. He finally asked, awkwardly, "Where did you learn to play like that?" Maria looked at him but said nothing at first. Then she gave a soft answer, "I used to play, a long time ago." Edward wanted more. He wanted details, a story, something to satisfy the new curiosity burning in him. But Maria didn't offer anything else. She simply nodded and went back. To her dusting, he didn't press her, not yet. But that short exchange kept echoing in his mind. I used to play. That meant she had stopped. Why? What had happened? That evening, Edward sat at the piano for the first time in years. He had taken lessons as a boy, just like many wealthy children, but he never loved it. He always saw it as a chore, something to impress guests with, nothing more. He placed his fingers on the keys and tried to play something simple, but it felt empty. The notes came out flat and soulless. He stopped and stared at the keys, frustrated. That's when he realized what was missing. Emotion. Maria didn't just play notes. She played feelings. Every sound she made told a story. That's why it shook people. That's why no one laughed. In the days that followed, Edward began to notice more about Maria, how she moved quietly but saw everything, how she seemed to listen more than speak. He realized that she had been around for years, and he had never truly looked at her, never cared. About her life, her story, her pain. One afternoon, he asked his chef about her. Maria. The chef said, surprised, she's been here for over 10 years. Comes in early, stays late, never complains, never asks for anything. Do you know anything about her past? Edward asked. The chef shook his head, knowing that she's not. From here, somewhere in South America, I think. She has an accent, but she doesn't talk much about her life before this job. That wasn't enough for Edward. His interest was no longer casual. He was beginning to feel something strange. Guilt. Guilt that someone like her had been living in his house all these years, carrying a history he never noticed. So he started, asking gently. One day, while she was arranging books in the library, he said, "You know, Maria, people are still talking about your music." She gave a soft smile. "People forget." "Not this time," he said. It was unforgettable. She didn't respond, but her hands paused for a second. Then she said, "Music is part of who I was before." Edward leaned forward. Before what? Maria looked at the window as if deciding how much of her soul to open. Then she spoke. "Before the war? Before I lost my home?" The room felt heavier with her words. "I'm sorry," Edward said quietly. Maria nodded. "It's all right. Life moves forward." Even when the music stops. That sentence hit him deeply. Life moves forward. Even when the music stops. Edward didn't know how to respond. He just nodded and left the room, but her words stayed with him. He began to search quietly, look through old records, staff documents, anything that might give him a clue. He found her full name, Maria Esperanza Ramos. And from there, he began to learn. She was born in Havana, Cuba. In her youth, she was a piano prodigy. She had played in theaters across Latin America. Her music had been recorded once, only once, before her world fell apart. Political unrest, a dangerous regime, and violence had torn her life to pieces. Her husband, a journalist, was arrested for speaking the truth. Her son, just 5 years old, went missing during a protest Maria had escaped the country through a refugee program. She arrived in the United States with no family, no job, and no plan. She found work as a housekeeper, first in small homes. Then, by chance, at the Langston estate, she never touched a piano again. Until that night, Edward sat alone in his study, reading the small details he had gathered. He felt something he rarely felt: shame. He had mocked her in front of everyone, not knowing she carried more pain than anyone in that room, not knowing that her music was a whisper from a life she had buried just to survive. The next day, Edward didn't know how to face her, but when he saw her arranging flowers in the hallway, he stopped and spoke. "I read about you," he said quietly. Maria looked up. She didn't seem angry or surprised, just calm. "I'm sorry," he said, "for everything." Maria gave a small nod. "I forgave you the moment you listened." Edward didn't expect that. He thought she would be upset. She wasn't. Her eyes showed something else. Peace. After that, things changed. Edward didn't treat Maria like a servant anymore. He began to ask her about music, about Cuba, about her past, and she shared little by little. He didn't push. He listened. Slowly, a strange friendship began to form. A quiet bond built not on wealth or status, but on respect. He asked if she would play again. She said no. Not yet. She had said all she needed to say that night, but something inside Edward had changed forever. He no longer saw his house as a palace, saw it as a place where a great artist had been hiding in silence, and he had almost missed it. Maria kept working. She didn't want praise or attention. She was happy to clean, to cook, to polish floors. But now, everyone looked at her differently. Even the other staff treated her with quiet admiration. One evening, Edward found her in the music room. She was not playing, just sitting at the piano, her fingers resting on the keys, eyes closed. She wasn't pressing them, just feeling them. He stood at the door and didn't speak, just watched. After a moment, she looked at him and said, "Music never leaves you. It waits." Edward smiled. "Can it wait for me, too?" Maria looked at him for a long time. Then, softly, she said, "Only if you stop wanting to impress and start wanting to feel." He nodded. He had finally understood. And the mansion, once filled with empty laughter and loud parties, began to feel quiet and real. The sound of Maria's music no longer filled the halls, but its memory lived in every corner, every silence, and every step Edward took from that day on. Days passed, but the memory of Maria's piano performance refused to fade from Edward Langston's mind. It was a man used to forgetting things quickly. Business deals, names of waiters, even the faces of people he had once dined with. But he couldn't forget the way Maria's music had touched the room, and touched something deep inside him that he hadn't even known was there. He kept replaying the moment in his mind. The sound of her fingers on the keys. The way silence had filled the room right after. The way he had felt small, powerless, and strangely alive. That was the word, alive. It had been years since he had felt anything that wasn't connected to profit, status, or control. But in that one night, Maria had given him a glimpse of something more, something real. The next few weeks were quiet. No more parties. No more loud laughter echoing through the marble halls. Edward began to spend more time alone. He stopped inviting people just to impress them. He canceled 2 business dinners and ignored invitations to charity events where his name would be printed on banners. Instead, he started walking the halls of his mansion and noticing the things he never had. The creaks in the floor, the dust on forgotten books, the way the afternoon light touched the piano in the music room. He also began to notice Maria more. He watched how she moved, how calm she always was. She never complained, never asked for favors. She simply worked quietly and with focus. Now Edward saw the grace in her hands, the tired strength in her eyes, the dignity in her silence. She was no longer invisible. One afternoon, he saw her placing flowers in a crystal vase near the window. The light hit her face just right, and he thought, "This woman carries a whole world inside her. I never saw it." He cleared his throat. Maria turned slightly, but didn't stop arranging the flowers. "I've been thinking about that night," he said. Maria nodded, but didn't look at him. "You were extraordinary," he added. "Thank you," she said softly. There was a pause. Edward felt awkward. Wasn't used to this kind of conversation. "I looked up your name," he admitted. "I found some articles. You were very well known." Pianist in Cuba. Maria finally turned toward him. Her face was calm, but her eyes had a distant look. "A long time ago," she said. "Another life." "I'm sorry for everything you went through," Edward said. Maria gave a sad smile. "You didn't cause the war." "No, but I mocked you that night. I only asked you to play because I thought it would be funny." Maria looked at him, directly this time, and yet you listened. Edward didn't know how to respond. Those words sat heavy on his chest. "I'm not proud of who I was," he said quietly. Maria tilted her head, then become someone else. Simple words. They struck him hard. Later that evening, Edward found himself at the piano again. He sat there, pressing random keys. Nothing sounded right. He didn't know what he was trying to do. Maybe he wanted to feel what Maria felt. Maybe he just wanted to understand. The next day, he made a strange request. During breakfast, he approached Maria and asked, "Would you teach me?" Maria looked confused. "Teach you the piano," Edward said. I want to learn. For real. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, "Why?" Edward paused. "Because I want to feel something. That money can't buy." That answer seemed to satisfy her. "All right," she said. "Tomorrow morning, music room. Be on time." It began. The lessons were quiet. No one else knew. Maria didn't bring books or talk about theory. Him to listen, to feel, to stop trying to impress and start trying to connect. "Music isn't about perfection," she said one morning. "It's about truth." Edward struggled at first. His fingers were stiff. He made mistakes. He got frustrated. But Maria was patient. She didn't laugh or criticize. She simply corrected him gently and made him try again. Every day they spent an hour together. And with each lesson, Edward began to change not just in music, but in life. He started talking to the staff more kindly. He asked them how their families were doing. He stopped barking orders and began saying, "Please," and "Thank you." One day, while practicing a soft melody, Edward asked Maria, "Do you ever miss the stage?" She paused, then answered, "Sometimes. But I don't miss the attention. I miss the music. The feeling." "You still have it," he said. She smiled. "Yes, but it's different now. It's mine." It stayed with him. News about Maria's performance had started to spread quietly. One of the guests at the party had recorded a small clip on their phone. It had found its way to a local music blog, then to a cultural newspaper, and then to a well-known magazine. Soon, people started calling. Reporters, agents, producers, they all wanted to talk to Maria. They wanted interviews, albums, public performances. They said things like "comeback" and "hidden genius." Brought the offers to her. She looked at the stack of letters and emails and gently pushed them aside. "I don't want to go back," she said. "But they want to hear you," he replied. "I said what I needed to say that night. The rest would just be noise." He didn't understand at first. But then he realized Maria had made peace with her past. She had survived it. She had found a quiet life where she could breathe, even if it meant living in the shadows. Edward respected that, still. One magazine went ahead and published a story about her, the housekeeper, who played her soul into a room full of millionaires. It didn't use her name, but people began to guess. The story became viral online. Suddenly, strangers were talking about the mystery pianist in the mansion. People speculated, praised, argued. But Maria stayed silent. Edward asked if she was. "Upset, no," she said. "They will forget soon. I'll still be here, living my life." Her calmness amazed him. But Maria's story had already changed one life, Edward's. He stopped investing in luxury apartments. Instead, he started funding music programs for low-income children. He built a music center in the city and named it the Esperanza Center, using her middle name, which means hope. He told her about it one afternoon. She looked surprised. "You did this for me?" "No," he said, "because of you." Maria smiled. It was the kind of smile that showed both pride and sadness. She knew what it cost to make a difference. Edward didn't become a perfect man. He still struggled with his temper sometimes, still liked his expensive suits and rare wines. But he had changed, deeply. He no longer needed to prove anything. He no longer laughed at people just because he could. And he had stopped pretending. That money made him more important. He had learned something that most people never do. True power doesn't come from wealth. It comes from kindness, from listening, from learning when to be silent. One morning, he found Maria playing in the music room again. She didn't notice him. Her eyes were closed. Her fingers moved softly, and the notes floated like feathers. He didn't speak, just listened. And in that moment, he realized he was finally beginning to understand. What she had felt that night, he was no longer the man who wanted to laugh. He was the man who had been, silenced by music, and he was grateful. The days had become slower in the Langston mansion, not in a boring way, but in a quiet, peaceful way. The loud laughter and rich parties were now a thing of the past. Instead, soft music could sometimes be heard coming from the music room. Edward Langston, practicing the piano, his fingers still learning, still stumbling, but improving with time. The once proud millionaire had turned into a man of silence, thought, and purpose. Maria still worked in the house. She didn't treat Edward differently, even though he had changed so much. She continued to clean, arrange flowers, and move through the halls with her calm grace. But now, there was mutual respect between them. No longer was she the invisible housekeeper. She was Maria Esperanza Ramasa, woman with a soul so deep it could silence a room with just a few notes. Edward, however, was not satisfied with just learning piano. Something had opened inside him after hearing her play. He had started asking himself questions about life, about the past, about who Maria really was, not just her talent, but her pain, her memories, and her silence. One evening, during a slow and gentle practice session, Edward asked, "Do you ever think of going back?" Maria didn't look up from the keys. "Back to Cuba?" she asked. He nodded. "Double quotes every day," she whispered. There was a long pause. "But it's not the same anymore," she continued. "The places are still there. The streets, the buildings. But the people I loved, they're not." Edward didn't speak.
Eyes.
He listened, because he had learned that sometimes silence was the only way to honor someone's truth. Maria closed the piano and stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the garden. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. "I had a husband," she said. "His name was Carlos. He was a journalist, brave, too brave. He wrote the truth even when it was dangerous." Edward listened without interrupting. "They took him one night, said he was spreading lies. But all he did was write what he saw. They never told me where he was. I waited. For weeks, months, then I stopped waiting." Her voice didn't shake, but her eyes looked tired, and my son, Diego, he was only 5. We were at a protest, just marching. I held his hand. Then a noise. People ran, smoke, screaming. I let go for 1 second. 1 second. Edward felt a lump in his throat. "I never found him," she said. Never saw him again. Tears didn't fall from her eyes. She had cried all her tears long ago. What remained now was silence, heavy, heartbreaking silence. "I left Cuba because staying meant dying," she said. "Not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. I had to leave to survive." Edward walked closer, but kept a respectful distance. "I had no idea," he said quietly. "Most people don't," she replied. "They see a uniform, a mop, a tray. They don't see the story." He nodded slowly. "I want to help." Turned toward him, surprised. "Help." "I've started something," Edward said. "Music center. A place for young musicians who can't afford lessons. I named it after you, the Esperanza Center." Maria looked shocked. "You shouldn't have," she said. "I had to," Edward replied. "Because your music helped me. It changed me. I believe it can help others too." Maria sat down slowly. She didn't speak for a moment. Then she said, "You are not the man I met years ago." Edward gave a sad smile. "No, that man is gone. He died the moment you played that first note." There was silence again. "Okay." But this time, it felt full, not empty. In the following weeks, Edward invited Maria to see the music center. Hesitant at first, but finally agreed. They drove together to the city. The center was still under construction, but almost finished. Bright walls. Soundproof practice rooms. Old instruments donated by musicians who believed in second chances. It's a large hall with a stage. When Maria walked in, she stopped. Her eyes moved slowly around the space. There were children laughing in one room, trying violins. In another, a teacher was showing kids how to read sheet music. The entire building felt alive. She walked into the main hall and saw the name. Carved into the wall, the Esperanza Center for Music and Healing. Her hands touched the letters. "I don't deserve this," she whispered. "You deserve more," Edward said. "But this is a start." Suddenly, one of the music teachers approached them. He recognized her from the online article. Are you the woman who played at the Langston estate?" Maria nodded politely. The man was nearly breathless. "Your playing. It changed my life. I've never heard anything like it." Maria gave a small smile. It wasn't just music, it was memory. Word began to spread. But Maria still refused interviews and public performances. She was not interested in becoming famous. Her music was not for sale, it was for healing. But she did agree to one thing: teaching. She began giving private lessons at the center once. A week, she taught refugee children, orphans, and teenagers from broken homes. Her lessons were not about speed or perfection. She taught them how to express emotion, how to use music to tell their stories, and slowly, the students began to bloom. Some of them had never spoken about their pasts, but through music, they began to share. One girl who had lost her parents in a car accident wrote her own piano piece. A boy who had survived cancer played a violin solo that made the audience cry. Maria didn't cry, but she felt everything. One evening, after a student recital, Edward asked her, "Do you miss performing?" Maria thought for a moment, then said, "No, this is enough. More than enough." And Edward believed her. That night, he walked her to her cottage on the edge of the estate, something he had never done before. The stars were out. The garden was quiet. At the door, Maria turned to him. "You've changed," she said. "I had." "Too," he replied. "You gave me no choice." They both laughed gently. Then Maria said something she had never said before. "Thank you." Edward looked surprised. "For what?" "For listening," she said. "That's all I ever wanted." "For someone to listen?" He nodded, deeply moved. "You taught me how." That night, Edward sat at his own piano. He played a melody Maria had taught him. It was slow, imperfect, but honest. As he played, he realized he wasn't just playing notes. He was playing his transformation, from a man who mocked to a man who listened, from a man who used people to a man who respected them, from a man filled with noise to one who understood the power of silence. Maria had changed his life. But more than that, she had saved it. He looked out the window toward her cottage. A soft light glowed inside, and he knew her music would live forever. Not in stadiums, not in records, but in the hearts of the broken she helped heal, and in the soul of the man who once wanted to laugh, but instead was left speechless. Years went by, but the memory of that one unforgettable night, the night Maria played the piano in front of the rich guests, never left Edward Langston. It was the night that had changed everything, from the way he looked at others to the way he looked at himself. Before that night, he had been a man full of pride, arrogance, and emptiness. After that night, he had started a new journey filled with meaning, silence, music, and reflection. Edward didn't go back to throwing wild parties. He no longer cared about being the center of attention. His name didn't appear in magazines as much anymore, and he was fine with that. What mattered to him now was not how many people praised him, but how many lives he could touch quietly. The Esperanza Center continued to grow. The music room stayed full, not with noise, but with honest sound. Students from different backgrounds came, children who had suffered loss, young people who had faced poverty, and teenagers carrying heavy secrets. They came because they had nowhere else to place their pain. And Maria gave them the space too. Pour it into the piano, the violin, the guitar, whatever instrument called to them. Maria didn't talk about her past anymore. She didn't need to. Her life was no longer about what she had lost, but what she was giving. She had become a living example of quiet strength. Lessons were more than just music. They were lessons in patience, love, and finding peace in chaos. Edward would often sit quietly in the back of her class, just watching. He didn't speak. He didn't interrupt. He watched the way her students looked at her, not like a teacher, but like a healer. One of the boys she taught was named Jamal. He was 15 and had been through more than most adults. His mother had died from illness, and his father was in prison. He barely spoke when he joined the center. But under Maria's guidance, he found music, wrote a song about pain and hope. When he performed it on stage during the winter concert, the whole room cried. Even Edward had to wipe his eyes. And Maria, she just placed a hand over her heart and smiled softly. Not long after, something unexpected happened. Maria became ill. It started slowly: tiredness, small coughs, pain in her chest. At first she ignored it. She had been through worse. But the pain grew. One day during a lesson, she fainted. Edward rushed her to the hospital. The doctors were gentle, but their words were sharp like knives. "It's late-stage cancer," they said. "It has spread." Edward's heart sank. Maria listened to the news quietly, then nodded. "I understand," she said. Edward held her hand. "We'll fight this. We'll try everything." But Maria shook her head gently. "No more battles," she said. "Let me have peace." She returned home, and Edward made sure she had everything she needed. Nurses visited, but she didn't want hospitals or machines. She wanted sunlight, quiet, music. One evening, Edward sat beside her in the garden. The flowers she had once planted were now blooming around her small cottage. She looked weaker, thinner, but her eyes were still full of grace. "I'm not afraid," she said softly. "I've lived, I've lost, and I've healed." Edward nodded, his throat tight. "You gave me music again," she added. "You gave it a place to live, even after I'm gone." He wanted to tell her how much she meant to him, but the words didn't come. She looked at him and smiled. "You don't have to say anything." "I know." That night, Edward couldn't sleep. He sat at the grand piano in the mansion, same one she had played all those years ago. He tried to play the piece she had first performed, the one that had silenced everyone. He played slowly, carefully. The notes weren't perfect, but they were honest. Tears rolled down his cheeks as he played. He realized that this music wasn't just hers anymore. It had become part of him, and part of the world she had touched. A week later, Maria passed away in her sleep. The entire staff at the Langston estate cried. The students at the Esperanza Center held a candlelight memorial. Edward sat alone in the music room for hours, staring at the piano keys. He organized a private funeral. No photographers, no reporters. Just people who had truly known her. At her service, he stood up and said only a few words. She played the piano once, and the world stopped. And in that silence, we found our hearts. After the funeral, Edward did something unexpected. He asked to play a song. Everyone turned in surprise. Edward had never performed publicly, but he walked to the small piano placed near the altar and sat down. Then, with trembling fingers, he began to play. It was the same melody Maria had played on the night that changed everything. But this time, the notes came not from her hands, but from the man who once asked her to play just so he could laugh. Now he played with his whole heart. The room was silent. No one laughed. Everyone listened. When he finished, he stood up, bowed his head, and walked away without saying a word. The sound of that song stayed with the guests for days. In the months that followed, Edward dedicated himself fully to the Esperanza Center. He created a scholarship in Maria's name. He opened new branches of the center in other cities. He even started learning how to teach music to children, using the same gentle methods Maria had once used on him. He never remarried. He never held another party, but he lived with purpose. And every year, on the same day Maria had first played the piano at his party, he would sit at that grand piano in the mansion and perform that same melody. No guests, no cameras, just him, in her memory. He kept a photo of her in the music room, a black and white picture of Maria, young and smiling, sitting beside a piano in Havana, and under it a small plaque. She played from her soul, left the world speechless. Her music never became famous in the traditional sense. She never signed a record deal or stood on a stage under bright lights, but in the hearts of those she touched in Edward, in her students, in the quiet rooms of the Esperanza Center, Maria's music lived on. And Edward, the man who once wanted to laugh at her, became the man who now listened for her in every note, in silence, in gratitude, in love.